almost a year after the Second World War had ended, Stalin's intelligence services embarked on a massive and secret investigation. Codenamed Operation Myth, it was subtitled An Investigation into the Disappearance of Adolf Hitler. The secrets of Operation Myth have been locked away in the Moscow State Archive for 50 years, until now.
We only discovered these files about 2 years ago. Before that, they were so sensitive that their very existence wasn't even recorded here.
Operation Myth was sparked by Soviet fears that Hitler might have escaped from Berlin. It began with repeated and brutal interrogations of captured survivors from the Berlin bunker and culminated in a forensic whodunit that led to the discovery of Hitler's skull. This was the last and most thorough in a line of investigations that had begun even before the war had ended. In 1938, Hitler had said, "Give me 10 years, and you'll not recognize Germany again." His timing was only slightly out. This was Berlin in May 1945, torn apart by weeks of bombardment from Allied aircraft and Soviet artillery. On May the 2nd, the German forces defending Berlin surrendered to the Red Army.
Удивительный день, потому что
It was an amazing day, because the thunder had suddenly stopped, the endless thunder of fighting and artillery. The Germans were throwing down their weapons, and many of them were taking off their helmets too, and throwing them on the ground. Then they were lined up into columns. It seemed like the entire Berlin army was there.
Очень большое войско.
But even capturing Berlin was not enough for Stalin. He wanted Hitler, dead or alive, and every Soviet brigade wanted to find the Führer and present him to Stalin. The reconnaissance unit of the 3rd Shock Army had scoured the streets, questioning anyone who might have information on Hitler's whereabouts. Even before the city fell, it had pinpointed his hiding place.
Девушка перешла линию фронта.
We'd found a young woman who was trying to get across the front line.
Она сопровождала.
She told us that she was a nurse and that she had taken some wounded people to the Reich Chancellery.
В Рейхканцелярии.
And when she got there, she'd heard from other medical staff and some soldiers that Hitler was there in his bunker.
Там, в бункере.
The entrance to the bunker complex stood here, in the center of Berlin. Hitler's quarters were 50 feet below ground, surrounded by a warren of small rooms and narrow corridors that ran under the Potsdamer Platz into the bowels of the Chancellery. These are the last pictures of the bunker, taken just before it was sealed by the East Germans in 1988. The murals by Hitler's SS bodyguards would have been amongst the first sights to greet the Russians who entered here on May the 2nd, 1945. By that time, Soviet intelligence had learnt that several of Hitler's closest advisors, including Nazi Party Secretary Martin Bormann and Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, had been living in the bunker during the last days of the battle. Hitler himself had taken up residence here on January the 17th. This is the last photograph taken of him, standing by the bunker entrance surveying bomb damage. When, on May the 2nd, the first Soviet troops reached the Reich Chancellery, they found Hitler's world in ruin. Passing through the building to the garden beyond, they arrived at the emergency exit to the bunker. There, on the ground, a few feet away, lay the charred bodies of Joseph Goebbels and his wife, Magda. Their 6 children were later found dead in their beds inside the bunker. They had been poisoned.
Nur Frau Goebbels.
It was just Frau Goebbels. She was the only one who didn't want to let the children go. She wanted them to die with her. And I remember Dr. Naumann telling me that Goebbels himself had wanted the children to be evacuated from Berlin. After the children were dead, Frau Goebbels came downstairs crying. She sat at the table in the room next to mine and started playing a game of cards, a game of patience.
Next to arrive at the Chancellery was the reconnaissance unit of the 3rd Shock Army. They brought with them one of Hitler's former confidants, Admiral Voss, now a Soviet prisoner.
Прежде всего, мы обратили внимание,
the first thing we saw there was a large, dried-up fountain made of concrete.
довольно большое такое бетонное сооружение.
It was full of dead bodies. You couldn't fail to notice it the moment you walked in. Voss went over to look in it and called out, "Wait a minute, this is what you're looking for. Here he is. That's Hitler." Then he studied the body for a time, and finally he said, "No, I was wrong. It's not Hitler."
But the press was told that Hitler had been found, causing embarrassment and anger in Moscow.
There was one other detail. Maybe I'm wrong, but the body had no shoes on, only socks, and they were darned. Tell me, would Hitler wear darned socks? Surely not.
The following day, the Smersh counterintelligence unit joined the hunt for Hitler in the Chancellery. Like those before them, they made their way to the bunker exit.
Один из этих бойцов обратил внимание, это совсем рядом.
One of the soldiers noticed that about 3 meters from the bunker doorway, some earth had been disturbed. So they started digging and found 2 badly charred bodies. But they decided it wasn't Hitler, so they simply buried them again.
But the next day, interrogators learned from high-ranking prisoners that the bodies of Hitler and his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, had been burnt before burial. So the 2 charred corpses were exhumed again.
Такая масса сгоревшего тела, но с элементами все-таки человеческой.
It was all a mass of burnt flesh. There were elements of human form. There was a hand and some other recognizable features. I mean, it was clearly a human being and the body of a man. But I had no wish to examine it in any detail, and the face was unrecognizable. So maybe it was Hitler. So what?
But the Smersh unit was worried that another brigade would take the bodies and steal the credit. So the two corpses were bundled into ammunition crates and spirited away. The corpses from the bunker garden were brought to this clinic in Buch, on the outskirts of Berlin. Once an asylum for the insane, but by then a pathology lab, it was here that the autopsies were done on the bodies believed to be Hitler and Braun on May the 8th, VE Day, by a team of 5 forensic scientists of the Red Army. The male, they concluded, had died from cyanide poisoning. There was no mention of a bullet wound. So why the inconsistencies? Professor Norman Stone is the only historian to have studied the files of Operation Myth, which include the autopsy.
In the first place, it's a bit sloppy. They're in a hurry. It's VE night. The second thing is that I suspect they were being leaned on by somebody simply to say he didn't shoot himself like a man of guts. He munched on poison, and that he'd killed his wife first of all. It sounds like good propaganda, and I suspect they were leaned on. I mean, doctors in the Stalin system were leaned on. We can demonstrate it in other cases.
The forensic team did at least acknowledge that the bodies were so damaged they could only be identified with certainty through their teeth. Smersh officers now scoured Berlin for Hitler's dentists. It was no easy task in a city in chaos, from which half the population was trying to escape. But they did find Käthe Heusemann, a dental assistant who had worked on the bridges for Hitler's teeth. She was ordered to make a drawing of his dental works from memory. Her sketch almost exactly matched the teeth from the charred body in the bunker garden. Smersh was convinced and planned a major presentation to Stalin. Along with the confirmation of Hitler's death, Smersh presented Stalin with a wealth of trophies plundered from Hitler's apartments in the Chancellery. A tapestry that has been locked away for 50 years of Hitler standing before a Nazi Europe. A walking stick celebrating the annexation of Austria. And even a sketchbook of Hitler's simple drawings, dating from 1910 to 1921. This, too, has never been put on public display. Whether or not Stalin believed the reports of Hitler's death, he certainly did not share them with his Western allies. At the Potsdam Conference in July, he told President Truman that Hitler had not been found and was assumed to be in hiding in the West. For many years, it has been claimed that Stalin was orchestrating a deliberate disinformation campaign.
I suspect myself that the reason is much more simple, that they knew that the autopsy they'd made was not altogether right, and that if they had to deliver this bag of bones to the Allies, then there would be a certain amount of discredit to the Soviet Union out of it. I think that's much more likely.
After Potsdam, it was the Allies' turn to be embarrassed. Hitler was seen everywhere, from a farm in Denmark to the Pampas in Argentina. The chief of British counterintelligence in Germany, Dick White, resolved to scotch the rumors.
He had actually been told by the Russians in Berlin about Hitler's death, so he was astonished when, sometime later, they went into reverse and even accused the British, how seriously I don't know, but actually accused the British of keeping Hitler alive in the British zone for future use against them. And this was an astonishing volte-face, and Dick White told me that he had decided to settle the matter, that one couldn't go on like this. He told me this in September, 4 months after it had all been apparently clear. And he said he was going to have an inquiry, and he asked if I would undertake it.
Major Trevor Roper travelled through the wreckage of Germany searching for people who'd escaped the bunker. Some he traced back to their homes. Others he found in prisoner of war camps. Within 8 weeks, he'd completed his mission. His report chronicled the last 10 days in the Berlin bunker, and he had no doubts what had happened to Hitler.
I reported that he was dead, that his body had been partially at least burned, that it had been buried probably in a shell hole in the garden of the Chancery, and it, as far as I knew, had not been, at that time, had not been dug up. But it had been buried, he was dead, and there was no question of his having escaped.
But in Moscow, they were now doubting their own intelligence reports. It wasn't just the autopsy that raised suspicion. The interrogations, too, were discovered to have been less than thorough.
There were some very remarkable conflicting statements. Some people said that he'd killed himself on the 29th, other people said it'd been on the 30th. There was an extraordinary story that somebody had shot the corpse. People looked at the burning of the bodies from different angles and pronounced that it had happened in different places in the Reichskanzlei garden, this sort of thing. So there were all sorts of weak spots in the original investigation.
Soviet nerves might have been calmed had they been able to re-examine the body. But Hitler's body never reached Moscow. After the autopsies here in Buch, Hitler's and Eva Braun's remains had been taken out of Berlin by the Smersh unit as it moved west with the Third Shock Army. And each time they stopped for the night, they hid the bodies from prying eyes by burying them, often in nearby woods. At one point, the corpses were unearthed from their temporary graves by other Soviet soldiers digging for buried treasure. The Smersh unit returned to find the bones strewn over the undergrowth. They packed them back into their boxes and continued their journey. The bodies were finally laid to rest here in Klausener Street in Magdeburg, behind the house at number 36, where Smersh had its East German headquarters. For 25 years, Hitler and Eva Braun lay buried under this puddle in a yard that now belongs to a firm dealing in waste disposal.
You see, to transport the bodies to Soviet Union, then it would be known that the bodies are in the Soviet Union. Then we will be then facing the demands from foreign countries, show the bodies where they are, etc., etc. So these sort of inquiries politically were not necessary for us. And then we would be attaching too much importance to what remains from the bodies.
The doubts raised by the original investigation might have passed without comment, but for a power struggle within the Lubyanka, headquarters of Soviet intelligence. By late 1945, Lavrenti Beria was Stalin's deputy prime minister, but his power base was under threat. The man most likely to depose him was Viktor Abakumov, who as head of Smersh had been in charge of the investigation into Hitler's whereabouts.
It's all a question of competing toads in that security system. If you can get a second investigation going, which looks perfectly regular and straightforward, and you can then demonstrate that Smersh got it wrong, then you're obviously earning a lot of brownie points. Now, if on top of that you're given the huge bonus that Hitler did actually escape from the bunker, then you can turn around to Stalin and say, look, Abakumov has got it completely and totally wrong.
In February 1946, Beria ordered a new investigation into Hitler's fate. Operation Myth was underway. Its opening shot was an order for the bodies in Magdeburg to be exhumed and re-examined. But nothing happened. A handwritten letter from a frustrated Soviet official in Berlin testifies that the bodies were not forthcoming, despite a request to Comrade Abakumov.
I think it's simply that Abakumov had things to hide. And then, if this body does turn up and the autopsy does turn out to have been wrong, then it doesn't look good for Abakumov, or for the whole Smersh organization.
Without the bodies, the investigators turned instead to the eyewitnesses. Survivors from the bunker, now held in Soviet prisoner of war camps, were rounded up and brought here to Butyrska prison in Moscow. A team of interrogators was assembled to probe their accounts of Hitler's death. Rochus Misch had run the switchboard in the bunker. He was taken to Butyrska in February 1946.
The questions were always the same, over and over, about Hitler, always about Hitler. Yes, whether he was dead, and that it wasn't Hitler who died in the bunker, but somebody else. But I can tell you again and again that it was Hitler, because I had seen him every day for 5 years. I told them, it was him, the corpse was Hitler's. And they always shouted, you're lying, you're lying.
Misch was one of the 4 key witnesses brought to Butyrska. The others were Hitler's adjutant, Otto Günscher, his valet, Heinz Linger, and his personal pilot, Hans Bauer. These were 4 of the men closest to Hitler in the days before he died. Over the winter weeks of early 1946, they were kept in cells whose temperature fell to 20 degrees below freezing. Fed a starvation diet, they were always interrogated at night. And when not being interrogated, they were being tortured. During those weeks, each of the 4 main witnesses from the bunker threatened or attempted suicide.
Es war sehr kalt drin. Ich habe mich zusammengerollt wie eine Schnecke, ohne jene Decke.
It was so cold there. I curled up like a snail, with no blankets. I just couldn't take any more. I wanted to die. Then I got hold of some paper and wrote to the minister, Beria. I said, I don't want to be beaten to death. I'm a soldier, so I asked to be shot.
Ich bin Soldat und ich bitte darum, dass ich erschossen werde.
But Beria wanted the prisoners alive. From their testimony, his interrogators would build a unique picture of the last days in the Berlin bunker, providing final proof of Hitler's fate. Much of what follows is taken from those interrogations. The Red Army had taken 2 years to advance the 1,200 miles from Stalingrad to the heart of Hitler's Reich. On April the 16th, 1945, it unleashed its opening barrage on Berlin and advanced towards the city. Yet in the fantasy world of the bunker, Hitler still dreamt of victory and spent hours poring over plans and models for the future Reich.
I didn't realize we were so close to defeat.
Hitler's pilot, Hans Bauer, was caught up in that fantasy, as he told his cellmate in Moscow, a POW turned informer.
the Führer was still busy planning the new Reich. He spent hours examining the models for new buildings intended for Berlin and other places. So we all believed things couldn't really be that bad. I know the reports from the front weren't good, but we thought if the Führer is looking at future building projects, the war couldn't be lost. We assumed he must have some secret means to win the war. A secret weapon none of us knew anything about, like the atom bomb or some death ray of incredible force.
On the 22nd of April, the first Soviet troops broke through to the suburbs of Berlin, while behind them, heavy artillery pounded the city center. In the bunker that morning, Hitler's adjutant, Otto Günscher, was discussing the explosions that could be heard on the Potsdamer Platz above them.
We were trying to calculate how far away the Soviet troops were. Hitler was there in the room. I knew there were large caliber artillery shells. I thought they were being fired from 15 miles away about. Just after that, a military position meeting was convened. General Krebs was very pessimistic. Hitler wanted several armies, including Steiner's army group and 9th Army, to counterattack in the northwest. Krebs made it clear that such a move must fail.
Hitler still ordered the counterattack and berated his generals for defeatism. But then, abruptly, he left the room.
That was when, for the first time, Hitler acknowledged the military situation was hopeless. He said he would stay in Berlin, even if it meant he'd end up putting a bullet through his own head. Now, he had said that before, but this was the first time that I believed him.
By now, Hitler's health was failing fast. He probably had Parkinson's disease. He also suffered from severe stomach cramps, insomnia, and fading eyesight. In the last year of his life, he was prescribed 92 different medicines. Many did more harm than good. Pervitin, an addictive amphetamine. Charcoal tablets containing strychnine. Eye drops with cocaine solution.
What was Hitler's health like by that time? Describe his appearance to me.
Heinz Linger knew Hitler as well as any. He was his valet.
Some time before, Hitler had developed a marked stoop. To keep up his strength, his doctor, Professor Morel, had prescribed injections of glucose and hormones of some kind. Hitler took these every other day. His right hand trembled a lot by then. That had started sometime early in 1944. Also, his right eye was badly inflamed. Had to be treated with cocaine drops. I often had to pour those drops into his eye myself.
In the last days of the war, Ernst Schenk was working in the Reichschancellery Hospital. One night, late in April, he was summoned to the bunker for a meeting with Hitler.
He came nearer and nearer to us. It was the first time I had seen him very close up, and I was utterly shocked. He looked lost, a very sick man. He hardly seemed human at all. I felt very sorry for him at that moment, but I knew he was a totally lost soul. Later, I always said he looked like a living corpse, a dead soul.
By the 25th, the city was virtually surrounded. Soldiers were deserting in their hundreds. Hitler ordered all deserters shot and now accused the entire German nation of being unworthy of him. He was more indulgent of his own staff. On the 22nd, he had allowed most non-essential personnel in the bunker to leave Berlin. There were now barely 20 people left attending Hitler. Amongst them was one Eva Braun. Unknown outside Hitler's closest circle, she had been his mistress since 1932. On her arrival in the bunker, she was dubbed the Angel of Death.
You have to imagine yourself being down in those narrow bunker corridors when suddenly a beautiful, attractive woman appears. For me, that encounter with Eva Braun came as a total shock.
Im Laufe eines Gesprächs hatte ich diesen Eindruck durchaus gewonnen, denn sie äußerte
During my conversation with her, from the way she talked to me about how some of Hitler's advisors, like Göring and Speer, had abandoned him, I got the strongest impression that it was absolutely her wish to be there with Hitler at this time.
Überhaupt ihr Wunsch war, in dieser Lage bei Hitler zu sein. Und sie sagte mir auch ganz
Then she said to me quite openly, I have come to Berlin to die at Hitler's side.
Gekommen, an der Seite von Hitler zu sterben.
For those still left in the bunker, there was little to do now but wait for Hitler and Braun to act out the last scenes of their personal drama.
Das war alles, wie soll ich denn sagen, wie in einem Betonsarg, das man mit dem Leben abgeschlossen hat.
It was like being in a concrete coffin, as if all life had ended. We didn't know whether it was day or night. We knew that Hitler wasn't going to leave the bunker again, and that the Russians were very near the Reich Chancellery, and that this was the end. I remember the last time I came into the bunker and closed those steel doors. They were like sluice gates. As I pushed on the handle, I thought, now I'm going to die. I'll never leave the bunker again.
On the night of the 28th of April, Hitler married Eva Braun. Some claim he did so to repay her years of loyalty. Others, that he simply wanted to avoid besmirching his posthumous reputation by dying in a suicide pact with his mistress. Whatever lay behind it, the wedding was a subdued affair.
He was wearing a wrinkled military jacket that he'd been lying in on his bed during the day. There was a gold party badge pinned to the jacket, an Iron Cross, first class, and a badge for being wounded in the First World War. Miss Braun looked pale and tired. She was wearing a dark blue silk dress with a grey fur stole around her shoulders. Goebbels and Bormann were waiting for them in the room. Then they closed the door. The whole ceremony lasted no more than 10 minutes. Then Bormann opened the door again, just as Hitler and Eva Braun were signing the marriage document.
Early the next morning, Hitler was shown a Reuters report of Mussolini's death 2 days earlier. It described how the bodies of Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci had been kicked and spat on by a crowd-turned mob in Milan. The bodies were then hanged by their feet. Hitler was determined to avoid a similar fate.
Morning of the 30th, Hitler sent for me and told me he was planning how to kill himself. By then the Russians were on the Potsdamer Platz. Hitler talked about being betrayed by his generals. Said his soldiers refused to fight for him. He said the Russians might drop bombs or sleeping gas on us. He told me we had invented this gas, but now the Russians had it too. Then he said, you must see to it that my body is burned, so it cannot be carried to Moscow and displayed like Mussolini's.
Hitler called for you. What did he say?
Hitler told me that he intended to shoot himself and ordered me to burn his body. He said Miss Braun would die with him, and I was to find petrol to burn her body too, so they could not be taken to Moscow and put on display. I got 6 20-liter cans from the garage of the Reichschancellery, but there was not enough petrol. So we had to drain the petrol tanks of some of the vehicles there.
The day before he died, Hitler said that only 2 creatures had remained loyal to him, his mistress and his dog. But it did neither of them any good. He ordered that Blondie, his pet Alsatian, be used as guinea pig for testing the cyanide capsules prepared for himself and Eva Braun.
Der Hundebetreuer, Herr Tonner, hat Blondie
The dog handler, Herr Tonner, brought Blondie to the toilet opposite my room, and Dr. Stumpfegger came to put her down. I went over and watched, out of morbid curiosity.
Dr. Stumpfegger
opened the dog's mouth, put something inside, and then pressed the jaws closed, and then Blondie keeled over.
At about 3:30 on the afternoon of April the 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun entered his sitting room. Each carried a small box of cyanide capsules. He had 2 guns, she had 1, a Walter 635. No one saw what happened next, but those who surveyed the scene moments later agree on how they died. Eva Braun had bitten on her cyanide capsule and died almost instantly, kicking over a vase of flowers in her death throes. Hitler had put a cyanide capsule between his teeth, and at precisely the moment that he bit into it, he'd shot himself.
First you tell us you heard the shot, and then you tell us you didn't hear the shot, but somehow you smelt the gunpowder. How is that possible?
Well, I wasn't next door. I was in the passage 2 rooms away. Maybe the smoke came through the air conditioning.
So all along you've been lying!
Rigorous as ever, the interrogators cross-examined the prisoners time and time again, searching for discrepancies in their accounts of how Hitler died.
Describe what you saw when you went into his room.
Hitler was sitting on the left side of the sofa. He was dead. Both his guns were lying on the floor. There were bloodstains on the walls and the sofa and on the carpet. His wife was sitting next to him. Her legs were drawn up under her. There was no visible wound on her.
Otto Günscher had claimed that Hitler died not on the sofa, but on one of the armchairs. But he'd entered the room an hour after the suicides.
By that time, the bodies had been taken away. I just assumed Hitler must have been sitting in the armchair, and his wife had been sitting on the sofa. And not far from the table in the bloodstain was Hitler's gun on the floor.
And the blood on the sofa was clearly visible.
I'm telling you what I saw. Why would I lie? I'm only telling you what I remember, what I am sure of.
Faced with unshakable eyewitness evidence that Hitler had indeed died in the bunker, the investigators turned to the manner of his death, hoping to prove, as this Soviet film claimed, first, that he had forced Eva Braun to die with him.
Ich will nicht sterben. Nein. Nein. Nein.
And then, that he had been too cowardly to die like an officer by shooting himself.
Inge. Inge.
They wanted to show it was his valet, Heinz Linger, who shot him after he had died from cyanide poisoning.
When I went into the room, Hitler was already dead. There was a bloodstain on his right temple. It was clearly visible. That must have been where the bullet went in.
You're lying! All of the testimony shows he was shot through the mouth. He couldn't have done that at the same time as taking poison.
I did not shoot him. I told you what I saw. There was a mark, a bloodstain. It was there.
In June 1946, the prisoners from Butyrska were taken by train back to Berlin in an attempt to resolve the matter of Hitler's death once and for all. They were brought here. This was the bunker garden where Hitler's body had been burned. Rochus Misch was one of the prisoners brought back to Berlin. His testimony today is the same as he told his interrogators then.
It was Hitler who died down there in the bunker. It was no one else. And it was here, at the exit from the bunker. The exit was here, and there was a bomb crater beside it. The bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun were placed here. They were wrapped in blankets, and petrol was poured over them. That happened right here, on this very spot. That's how Hitler was burned.
About an hour later, the charred remains of Hitler and Braun were buried at the spot where they had been burned. Once the prisoners taken back to Berlin had pinpointed the place where Hitler was buried, the area was dug up again. It was then that Operation Myth found its most important new evidence. 4 fragments of a man's skull, the largest of which had a bullet hole through it. This, for once, corresponded with the original autopsy, which had reported that part of Hitler's skull was missing. The fragments were fitted together and photographed.
To me, it's quite obvious why these fragments were not exhumed in 1945, but were only found in 46. It was because the shot with which Hitler killed himself dislodged this particular portion of the skull, so it was left hanging on only by the skin. You can see this bone contains a bullet hole. This is the exit wound, and here on the inside is the entry point. And when they burnt the corpse, the skin burned and this fragment became detached. And here you can clearly see the marks from the flames.
The investigation team prepared a presentation pack to show Stalin what they had found in Berlin. Along with the skull were photos of Hitler's sofa and of the blood traces found in its lining. But Stalin was never shown the findings of Operation Myth. With Hitler certainly dead, Beria never had cause to use the report against Abakumov. In fact, both men outlived Stalin, but only just. Beria was shot by firing squad on Khrushchev's order in 1953. Abakumov was executed 15 months later. Linger, Günscher, Bauer and Misch were each sentenced to 25 years imprisonment for unspecified war crimes. They all returned home in the mid-1950s. As for the bodies in Magdeburg, they remained untouched until 1970, when Yuri Andropov was chairman of the KGB.
We reported to him that, well, still something remains from the bones of Hitler and Eva Braun. And then it was decided to destroy them completely. And it was done in 1970. So there is an act duly done on the destruction. I assure you they were destroyed, that there is nothing remains from...
Were they blown up or burnt?
They was burnt, yes.
Why?
Well, you see, I was not burning that one themselves, so I am unable to describe you how they were burning them. But I assure you it was done faithfully, because some of my colleagues were doing that.
The day before he died, Hitler predicted to Nazi youth leader Arthur Axmann that Germany would be divided, but that eventually its people would reunite and rise again. He was right. Berlin is once more the capital of a unified Germany. But in this new Germany, the Reichstag, the democratic parliament that Hitler shut down, is the national parliament again. While the bunker, along with the ambitions of those who lived and died in it, has been reduced to rubble. And where Hitler burned, children now play.